The title of my paper, it's not really a paper, it's a research idea that I'm trying to pitch through this workshop, is Memory in the Times of Corona. And as most of you would know, this is a pun on the Marquez novel, Love in the Time of Cholera. So I'm sort of using that as a reference point. And of course, I will connect it to the broader framework of digital humanities, because that's obviously an area that interests me as well. And that's something which is very connected to memory studies, something which I directly deal with as a researcher. So I don't have a PowerPoint, which is a little ironical given that this is a digital humanities workshop. But then again, we are also doing humanities, so I just rely on my human voice. Hopefully that would make sense to everyone. So I would begin with looking at memory studies in terms of what that does as a discipline and what are the research inputs that can come from memory studies. So memory studies is a very interdisciplinary field of inquiry, which looks at the politics and the processes of remembering and forgetting. Now, I use the word remembering and forgetting quite deliberately, because sometimes in memory studies, actually often in memory studies, we spend more time, and we should spend more time looking at forgetting rather than remembering, because forgetting, as most of us know, is not an innocent activity. Forgetting can sometimes be a motivated activity. Forgetting can be a political activity. And one of the things that we do in memory studies, and this will connect interestingly with digital humanities as well, we'll look at the micro and the macro vectors of memory in terms of how the brain remembers, in terms of how the mind remembers and forgets, but also equally in terms of how a culture remembers, how a collective remembers, right? And we are interested in the Center for Memory Studies in IIT Madras. We are interested at the interface between these two vectors, between the micro vector and the macro vector, in terms of how the brain processes information and remembers and forgets, and also in terms of how cultures process information and remembers and forgets. Now, one key quality, one key concept that I would like to touch upon a little bit here, and hopefully connect it with digital humanities, is a concept of encoding. Right? Encoding is a very important concept in memory studies. Very broadly speaking, memory takes place through three different processes: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. These are three processes of memory. You encode information first, then you consolidate it, and then you retrieve it. We sometimes think of memory as only remembering, but actually memory is a three-tier process: encoding, consolidation, and retrieval. And all three processes must function in order for memory to function as well. Now, so what we're essentially looking at is memory not so much as a noun, but memory as a verb, memory as an activity. It's like gender. It's like, in terms of how Judith Butler looks at gender as an activity, gender as a verb. So we are also interested in terms of looking at memory as an activity, as a process of encoding, retrieval, and consolidation. Now, depending on the extent of retrieval, depending on the strength of consolidation, some memories become short-term memories, some memories become long-term memories in terms of how the consolidation happens. Now, let me focus a little bit on the first process, encoding. What is encoding? So, and here again, we are looking at the interface between the brain model of memory and the cultural model of memory, because every brain, every human mind encodes information, right? So encoding is a process through which experience becomes a neural pattern. So you experience something, and then that becomes a neural pattern, engram, it's technically called, in your brain. And of course, that may or may not become the memory, right? But that's the first process, encoding. In other words, encoding is giving a pattern to experience. Very conceptually speaking, it's like giving a pattern to experience. And this is where I think the interface or the collaboration with digital humanities will begin to happen, right? In terms of how we can give pattern to experiences. And of course, the patterns will differ from person to person, as a result of which, for instance, all of us in this room, we can be in the same event at the same time, and yet we can have very different memories of the same event, depending on what we encoded. Now, one thing that I should say at the very outset, and this is something which we are very interested in, those of us in literary studies, why are we interested in memory studies at all? Is because encoding, or the very process of memory, is a very biased process, right? So the brain is hardwired to be biased, right? So the human brain is a biased machine, it's a biased neural machine. So bias is something which is embedded in the brain. Now we have different kinds of biases: cognitive biases, color biases, emotion biases, etc. And of course, that bias will shape the process of encoding, right? In terms of what subject A will remember will be different from subject B will remember. The same event will be remembered differently by different subjects depending on the biases, right? So bias is something which is very, very intrinsic in the human brain. Now, when we talk about memory in these terms, we need to also understand that, and this is the interesting bit in memory studies, that is, when we look at memory as an activity, as I just described, encoding, consolidation, retrieval, etc., the process of encoding, ontologically speaking, in terms of how it happens, has erasure built inside it. In other words, encoding and erasure happen simultaneously. So when you're encoding a certain experience into a neural pattern, you're also leaving out some bits of that experience, right? So when you encode something into a pattern, you also leave out certain bits from that particular experience. In other words, if we are to remember something, we must be able to forget something. Now, this is where it begins to become interesting. This is where forgetting becomes not a passive thing, forgetting becomes an active thing. In other words, forgetting becomes a part of remembering in a certain sense. And that's something which we increasingly know from neuroscience, from philosophers of mind, culture theorists, etc., that forgetting and remembering go hand in hand. Every act of remembering, every act of memory has simultaneously an act of erasure, an act of forgetting. We must be able to forget. The human brain must be able to forget, right? In fact, there are some interesting case studies of people who cannot forget. They literally remember everything. And that is seen as a problem in neuroscience. That is seen as a pathology in neuroscience, that they can't process information. They have to store information without processing it. So the very processing of information is also a filtration of information. And that filtration of information must erase certain information as well, right? In other words, erasure and encoding happen simultaneously. Remembering and unremembering, remembering and forgetting happen simultaneously. Now, mind you, this doesn't stop only at the brain, right? This also operates at a collective level. Every culture, every nation, every history will have certain events, will have certain incidents, will have certain emotions, which it will keep commemorating, right? Through museums, through memorials, different kinds of things. But equally, every culture, every nation, every history would have certain events it would want to forget, right? So forgetting sometimes becomes, again, a process of production. Forgetting is produced, right? So you forget something deliberately. So I'll just give you one example, and this is the point where I'll sort of make the connection with digital humanities as well. And this is an anecdotal thing. This is something which happened to me, so this is experiential as well. And I guess the seeds of my research and memory studies were born at that particular moment. This is when I was in a PhD in Durham. So I think this might be familiar to some of you who have attended my sessions earlier, but I'll still say it. So I had a friend, white British person, very liberal, very critical of imperialism, very well-read, very well-traveled, much more well-read, more well-traveled than I am. So he wanted to see an Indian film, a Bollywood film. So I sort of picked a film randomly, and we started watching this film, which I'm sure is familiar to most of you, Rang De Basanti. I think it's a very popular film. It was released around 2006, I think, and I'm hoping most of you have seen it. So we started watching it together, this white British person and me, and we were housemates as well in Durham. And he was enjoying it till that point where those of you remember the film would know the Jallianwala massacre is shown in that film, right? The Amritsar massacre is shown in the film in black and white. It's like a very grotesque event, and it's slow down. It's technically a very good film. Those of you who've seen it would know. In terms of cinematography, editing, it's very good. So it was shown as a very grotesque event, as it was, of course, in the history of imperial history. And this friend of mine, who was otherwise very liberal, very open, very critical of imperialism, I should say again, got very, very uneasy, got increasingly uneasy. And at one point, he sort of got off and said that, just pause this for a moment. And then he said, can I ask you something? I mean, I know the empire was a terrible thing. I'm very ashamed of it as a white British person, etc. But this event at Amritsar, did it actually take place? This Jallianwala Bagh massacre, did it actually take place? And this is my turn to be surprised. I said, I mean, are you really asking me the question? And someone as well-read as you are, as well-traveled as you are, you don't know this happened, Jallianwala Bagh massacre. You're such a well-read person. He said, I had no idea until I watched this film. I had absolutely no idea this massacre took place. And I said, why? And he said that I never knew it because this is not taught to us in our history books, right? If you grow up in England, if you read history books as an English person, you get to hear about Winston Churchill, William Shakespeare, Nelson, all the lovely, glorious heroes of England. There's not a single chapter in British history which talks about imperialism, right? There's not a single chapter which talks about the empire. And that was a moment of epiphany for me, I think. This is way back. But that got me thinking that maybe forgetting is a very political thing. Maybe forgetting is not an innocent thing in terms of what a nation, what a collective, what an identity will choose to forget, right? Because if the British history will choose to remember Jallianwala Bagh, that doesn't bring a lot of glory to the history, right? So it'll talk about Winston Churchill, it'll talk about the Second World War, it'll talk about the evil Nazis in Germany, etc. But it'll not talk about the evil that the British Empire did in India. And I'll just give you one more example in terms of forgetting. And this is closer to home. One of the things which we face a problem in memory studies, and let's be open about it, that the moment you say you do memory studies, the automatic assumption that most people have, especially in the West, is that this must be about the Holocaust, right? This must be about the Second World War. This must be about, the Holocaust must feature in memory studies. And that's an automatic assumption that most people have, especially the Western academics have. Now, of course, the Holocaust was a brutal incident, and it was a terrible tragedy, one of the worst experiences in human history. We all know that. And I don't discount the fact that Holocaust studies should go on. I mean, of course, it should go on. We can always do more and more research on the Holocaust. But let me ask you a question over here. Around the same time when the Holocaust was happening, around the same time where this terrible tragedy that happened to the Jews was taking place in Auschwitz, etc., something very similar was happening in India. And in terms of statistics, more people got killed in Bengal at that time, right? Exactly the same time. And it was, again, it's seen as a catastrophe, but it was a man-made catastrophe. It was an engineered catastrophe. How many of us know that? Even in Bengal, I come from Calcutta. Even in Bengal, if you talk to a generation, let's say today, a millennia from Calcutta, no one knows about it. I'm talking about the Bengal famine. The Bengal famine took place exactly around the Holocaust, exactly the same time, and it killed more people in the streets of Calcutta than the Holocaust. And the entire Bengal famine was orchestrated by the British. Those of you who want to read on, you could find out, you can Google up. It happened not because we ran out of supplies, not because there was bad crop, but because all the crops, all the supplies were directed to the British troops, right? It was all siphoned off to the British troops just to feed the British troops who were fighting the Second World War, as a result of which there was nothing left. So the Bengal farmers began to die, and there are documents, there are photographs of people, dead bodies being pecked by vultures in the streets of Calcutta, literally in the streets of Calcutta, right? And the great Winston Churchill, who won a Nobel Prize for Peace and who was one of the great war heroes of Britain, when he was informed about the Bengal famine, when some British people said we should release some crops, people are dying on the streets. The great Winston Churchill's response was, if it is so bad, how come Gandhi is still alive? Let Gandhi die first, and then we'll release the crops. Nobody knows about this. It is not studied in Britain. It is not studied so much in India as it should be. So the point I'm trying to sort of corroborate over here is, when we look at memory and forgetting, these are not innocent activities. These are mediated activities. And this is how I'm going to connect to digital humanities now. Memory is a mediated activity. It must happen through a certain mediation. Right? It must happen through certain technology, certain circulation, certain ways of dissemination. And this is where digital humanities can come in a very, very crucial way in terms of what memories get circulated, what memories get disseminated, how would those memories getting disseminated, what is the technology through which memories can be disseminated. Now, very broadly speaking, Memory can be seen in two different ways. One is the emergent quality of memory. It emerges from somewhere, from the brain, from emotions, from consciousness, etc. But the other more important thing, especially for digital humanities, is how memory has a connective quality. It must connect to what is around it. And that connective quality of memory is exactly where technology can come in a very big way. And we in IIT Madras, we work when we do memory studies, we don't just limit ourselves to culture studies and literature. We also work with XR people who work on XR technology and augmented reality, mixed reality technologies. For instance, one of our collaborators is the XR lab of TCS based out of Chennai. And they were the ones who helped us digitize in a very interesting way. They made an artwork of Jallianwala Bagh. One of the first conferences which we did in IIT Madras in 2019 was the 100th year of the Amritsar massacre, which happened in 1919. So there was an artwork which was made at IIT Madras. You can look it up. I mean, if you Google Jallianwala Bagh conference, IIT Madras, that should appear. And what we did through the XR lab of TCS Chennai is we digitized it in a sense that the whole thing could be animated using a QR code. Right? So there was a QR code which was supplied and shared to all participants. If you stood in front of the big artwork, it was planted in the campus of IIT Madras. And if people looked at it through their phones, scanning it, they could hear the gunfire, they could hear the whole experience, they could see the whole experience, etc. So that was a very classic case in point in terms of how memory studies and digital humanities can come together in terms of recreating an event. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about recreation or reconstruction, because we find, interestingly, that more and more neuroscientists today are looking at memory not so much as an act of remembering, but as an act of reconstruction. So memory is an act of reconstruction in a certain sense. So technology such as this, technology such as augmented reality, external reality, mixed reality, virtual reality, these can play a very crucial role in memory studies in terms of how old events, forgotten events, events which are forgotten deliberately, in a very, sometimes in a political way. For instance, in the case of Britain, who don't want to remember the Jallianwala Bagh, that can be reconstructed in a very spectacular way. And that is how memory becomes an affective activity, which brings me to my third point, which is again the connective point between digital humanities and memory studies, which is affect studies, right? Emotions, right? Of course, the word emotions has motions in it, right? This is like fluid motions. Emotions is a kinetic quality. We are moved by emotions. Emotions are things which are moving feelings. And there's a three-dimensionality about emotions, right? It moves across something. It also moves us. Like, for instance, if we are to see an artwork of Jallianwala Bagh, which is digitized through your phone, and if you have the QR code and if you scan it, and if you see it, if you experience it, we see something moving in front of us, and we are also moved by it, right? So there is that loop of emotions which happen. And again, this is a very happy wedding of memory studies and digital humanities in a certain sense, because you're digitizing something and recreating it in a very interesting sense. And just the previous speaker, Professor Pankaj Sharma, was talking about how poetry can be produced out of this movement. And there's a lot of work on kinetic poetry. There's a lot of work on how poetry is, again, emotion, something you can see in front of you, the moving screen, the moving letters, and how that can sort of trigger emotions in you. And again, how that can sort of recreate emotions which may have been forgotten in a certain sense. So I think digital humanities is a very powerful tool. And if you look at digital humanities as an archiving tool, as an interactive tool, right, as an augmenting tool, something which can augment something, something which can interact, reconstruct something. So in that sense, it becomes, in a certain sense, also an act of remembering. Because if you're reconstructing an old text, which is presumably a loss, and if you bring it up again, you're also remembering it. And I'm using the word remembering with a hyphen, re-membering. You're remembering something which is at the risk of being dismembered, which is at the risk of being forgotten, right? So digital humanities becomes a very important tool against oblivion. It becomes a very important instrument against oblivion. So we can see a very direct, almost organic and cognitive connect between digital humanities and memory studies in a very crucial way. right? And this is something which we can talk about in more details later as well. And I'm happy to respond to emails if some people would like to write to us more about the center work, etc. But let's come to the other bit that I'm interested in, memory in the times of Corona. So why Corona? Why am I choosing Corona? What is it about COVID-19 that makes this alliance between digital humanities and memory studies even more pronounced? So I just gave you a philosophical alliance in a certain sense. But COVID-19, what I'm going to argue for the rest of this presentation is it has made this alliance at a very direct, pragmatic, experiential level, right? So for example, think of a format like this, the way we experience in this particular seminar, this particular workshop, which is entirely virtual in quality. We are all virtual presence. We are all disembodied voices. We have a projected persona on screen in terms of the images. And of course, we make our emotions, we exchange emotions, etc. And of course, what we're doing together is we're creating an event, which will hopefully be remembered in time. Right. But the whole point is what we're experiencing at this particular point in time is a very fluid sense of space and time. In other words, what COVID-19 has done in a certain sense is that it has made our experience of space and time more fluid in quality, right? It has sort of, in a way, defamiliarized our understanding of space and time. And this is an interesting point, defamiliarization. So what is defamiliarization? Some of us who are from literary background would know this is a technical term used in literature, and the argument is that literature, the literary medium, is in itself a language, a kind of language which will defamiliarize reality, right? So for example, if I were to tell you, let's just go for a walk. It's a nice evening. We will have fun. That's one way of looking at it. And if I were to tell you, let us go, then you and I, when an evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient eats rice upon a table. Now, at the level of information, I'm telling you the same thing. But what I'm doing is, in the second language, in the second medium, I'm defamiliarizing the language. I'm making it rhyme. I'm playing with the syntax. So the moment you read the second line, the moment you read the second passage, you are looking for meanings between the lines. You're trying to read between the lines. You're sort of thinking, oh, let us find out, maybe there's something hinted at in a certain sense, which is why poetry, despite its brevity, is the most difficult medium to understand. That's what people complain all the time. And then I teach BTech students in IIT Madras sometimes, and they say, oh, we can finish a novel, that's fine, but don't ask us to read a poem. Poems are more difficult to understand, not because they don't know the meanings of words. What they struggle with is the arrangement of words, right? It's a play of syntax. Now, again, what digital humanities can do in a very interesting sense, it can push this defamiliarization at an extreme level, at a more experimental level. Right? And of course, Professor Sharma before me was speaking about the ways in which words can be combined on screen, the kinesis of words on screen, etc. And that kinesis, that ability for the digital medium to sort of do almost anything with words in terms of putting and permuting and combining things, that can obviously open up more opportunities for us to defamiliarize reality in a very experimental way. Now, how does it connect to COVID? Why are we looking at this alliance during COVID-19? Now, as we all know, due to COVID-19, this pandemic, the phenomenon of this pandemic in a certain sense, which is a social phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon, a medical phenomenon, a biological phenomenon, but also an experiential phenomenon in a certain sense. We have all experienced COVID-19, right? Some of us have experienced it directly through a virus. For instance, I got affected by COVID-19 last year. I recovered, thank God for that. But some people have experienced it in different ways, distantly. But we've all experienced COVID-19, right? We have all survived till date COVID-19. Now, what that has done, my argument is this, that COVID-19 is not just a medical condition. COVID-19 is not just a virus. It's not just a virus which has affected us biologically. It is a phenomenon which has affected us culturally, socially, existentially. It has changed, it has wrought a paradigm shift on our sense of space and time. And I'm just not just talking about in terms of lockdowns. Like, for instance, you can only go out on a certain time, you can only access certain space. That's obviously there at a very pragmatic level. right? So for instance, when it's locked up at 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock or whatever. So human movements are determined by that, right? So you cannot step out beyond those times. You cannot step into certain spaces. So there are like forbidden spaces, forbidden times, and sanctioned spaces, sanctioned times. That's the legal thing. We all know that. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it, which is more complex, I think, and this is why digital humanities can come in a very interesting way, is because I think COVID-19, what this has done, it has changed not just space and time, it has changed our notions of trust and tactility, right? And that's a very important phenomenon, trust and tactility. Now, post COVID-19, or even during COVID-19, I don't think we can use the word post COVID-19 yet. I think I'm being too rosy and romantic. COVID-19 is still going on, so there's no post COVID-19 as of now. But during this pandemic, during this phenomenon, our sense of trust has wrought a permanent change, right? We cannot trust strangers. Forget about strangers. We can't even trust people we know, because we don't know who's carrying the virus. We don't know who is a carrier of a certain virus. We don't know who can contaminate us. That sense of trust is completely gone. And of course, tactility, in terms of how what we can touch and cannot touch. That can be a question between life and death. So trust and tactility have been changed at a very permanent level, which is the way you can connect with digital humanities now. So for instance, if you're looking at humanities, if you're looking at an experience of reading, if you're looking at an experience of consuming knowledge, if you're looking at an experience of disseminating knowledge through a non-tactile mode, this is what digital humanities has been doing for the longest time. So my argument is, my philosophical argument for this presentation is, COVID-19 has met digital humanities and memory studies together, not just esoteric disciplines. These have become a way of life, right? So digital humanities is not just an academic study, an academic endeavor, which has to be done through conferences and workshops or whatever. It is what we are doing now. It is what is happening now at an everyday quotidian level, which is why I congratulate the organizers for conceiving this workshop. It's such a timely workshop, I think, because my argument is, this is the world that we're living in today, where contactless exchanges, where digitizing things, where remembering and forgetting are happening at such spasmodic levels. These are not just academic activities anymore. These are experiential activities. These are activities which happen at a daily, everyday, quotidian level, right? And this is where I think the process of encoding, the process of defamiliarization, the process of representation, the process of reconstruction will be taking very, very different vectors. And they're already taking very different vectors, I think. So we're looking at trust, tactility, contactless, essential goods, non-essential goods, and all these things have become part of our daily vocabulary. I'll just give one more example, and then I'll sort of begin to wind up. So for instance, think of the generation. So when I say digital humanities is a norm, digital humanities is not an esoteric service, it's just an activity which you do every single day. Think of the generation of boys and girls, students, who were about to enter school, right? Who will probably not hold a textbook till they're 5 years old, right? Who will consume knowledge, who will consume information, who will consume the entire epistemic paradigm through our digital platform, right? Through our contactless platform, right? So the whole idea of knowledge, the whole memory of knowledge. So this is the most direct connection I'm making, memory studies and digital humanities. The whole memory of knowledge, in a certain sense, will be contactless, will be digitized, right? Through a non-textual model. And again, we can always define what a text is. We can define and redefine what a text is. But the point is, at a very experiential, pragmatic level, digital humanities and memory studies should receive added attention, should receive experiential attention, not just academic attention, experiential attention in a world we live in today. And the COVID world today, and this is why I titled my paper, Memory in the Times of Corona, right? Memory has become different, right? So our sense of memory, our experience of memory has become different. Our experience of a text, our experience of a poem, our experience of any knowledge system has become entirely different. And we have already moved into a digital world, in a digitized world. And this particular pandemic has accelerated that movement, has accelerated the transition from a contact a knowledge to a contact position, from that to a knowledge to a contactless position. And that contactlessness is something which has been produced out of this pandemic. So I stop at this point.